opening government, we posit that this decision was made out of emotion, was made out of the after effect of the immigration crisis that has happened not only within the European Union but also within the United Kingdom itself, with problems in the Middle East with regard to political instability and with regard to violence that has occurred there, which has led to the largest immigration crisis since in modern history. But on opening government, we stand on a couple of principles. The first principle being that the future generations and the future long-term development of a country is to be valued over short-term problems and decisions that are made out of passion. Secondly, we posit that there are certain technocratic as well as specific claims, especially to the economy, which have not been considered and not been adequately discussed when the vote to leave the European Union was made. Under those two grounds, we think it's justified then for the government to go against the will of the people and withdraw from this decision to exit from the European Union, despite what a little more than half of the country at this point in time has to say. What did we exactly mean by the principle of standing by the European Union? One of the main principles we stand on opening government is to analyze the voting clock itself. More than 60% of UK voters aged between 18 and 34 who are most likely to face the economic impacts of this policy and the economic consequences of this exit have voted hugely to stay in favor of remaining within EU membership. That is something that we strongly have to consider at opening government. It's not what the 60 and 70-year-old people in the country want, regardless of their political ideology. They might be liberal, they might be conservative, they might be whatever they want to be. However, it is in the best interest of the people who are most likely to face these consequences that want to stay. That is a principal consideration that opposition has to deal with. But two arguments to consider in this speech: the immediate impact and the long-term economic impact of this policy. Secondly, the barriers that the UK would face if the exit actually happened to immigration policy, while it's particularly bad for the country. Let's get straight into it. The immediate impact of the announcement of the Brexit vote and its results was that the pound was at a 30-year low. The AAA credit rating that the UK government had was lost, and the government borrowing immediately at that point became higher. The Bank of England was able to cut interest rates by, I think it was from 0.6 to 0.25%, and which was the lowest rate that it had gone to since for the last 7 or 8 years, in order to keep this balance alive, to avoid the financial crisis that might have happened had they not been able to do that. We can see that the pound is relatively stable, however, still it is at an all-time low. This might be a harm that the government is willing to buy at present. However, we're not willing to buy that the long-term effects of this or economic effects of this policy is something that the government should consider actually buying into. What are those long-term political and economic implications most likely going to look like? The first thing that we tell you is less influence in the international arena in general, right? Because right now, not at this time, right now, being a member of the European Union means that there are preferential trade agreements that you have signed with other European countries, and the European Union is now obviously going to impose stricter impositions on capital flow into London. This means that amongst, if not anything else, the most powerful cities in the European Union now, and the money, the capital flow that currently goes into London, now goes into Paris or goes into Brussels and goes into Munich. This we think, for the government of the United Kingdom, as well as the people of the United Kingdom, is incredibly detrimental to the economy and to the standing that they have with negotiations politically in the international arena. Notice that despite their small size, one of the main reasons why they're able to exert that much influence in international politics is because of the strength of the pound currency. That is a bargaining chip that they lose in the future in the case that the pound weakens to the extent that it probably might. Secondly, is the loss of investment that's most likely to occur if this exit happens. Three reasons why this is true. Regardless of what opposition bench tells you, that the currency might or might not go down, the fact is that investment is oftentimes based on signaling effects. It is based on perceptions and not an actual fact. This means that the economic consensus amongst experts is that the pound is most likely going to weaken, and that in and of itself is enough to detract external investment from Asia, from other parts of Europe, and from America into the European Union, which is really bad, right? It is estimated that around 800 to 900,000 workers will lose their jobs immediately within the first 2 to 3 years of retracting from the European Union itself. That is something that the government does not have a counter plan to contest because they were complacent about the fact that the vote would not succeed. That is something they have not taken into consideration while doing so. Closing.
Who are those workers, though?
So the workers at this point are mostly blue-collar workers. However, that does not remain that the UK does not at this point have a plan to rehabilitate those workers and to reinstate the economy that it had at this point. The second thing is that the potential for loss increases even further because recognize a large amount of this gap is fulfilled by migrant workers, which they are now losing by tightening immigration policy. What was the decision to leave the European Union mostly based on? We think that the decision of the Leave group at least was based on let's take back control. That is incredibly inflammatory and quite nationalistic rhetoric, which plays into the fact that there are certain people or individuals that are trying to take up your place in society and taking away your jobs. That is something that the long-term implications of which have not been considered. And also immigration policy works both ways. People who lived in Britain in the long term, and notice that these are the people who overwhelmingly want Britain to stay in the European Union in the long term, the people between the ages of 18 to 34, are most likely to face barriers and bureaucracy to entry into other countries in the European Union for work or for pleasure in the long term as a direct consequence of this policy, because the fundamental principle on which Brexit is based is taking back control of borders and increase of national security in direct contestation with economic development. We think that taking away that right of those individuals who voted in more cases than not to stay within the European Union is incredibly bad, because that leads to, first of all, restrictions on movement, but also secondly, restrictions in terms of opportunities for personal development and economic development. We think in certain cases the government can take a step ahead and look out for the future generations who want to stay, especially when long-term considerations for those people have not been considered. Incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much. We welcome the Leader of Opposition.
As I begin my outline, I urge you to remember the writ of democracy as a system in which the voices of the people are upheld. Now tonight I aim to outline 3 main points which emphasize why this motion is legitimate. On to my first point. Why must we respect the referendum on the basis of democratic legitimacy? Well look, we recognize that the referendum is not technically binding, but it has been formed and it is supported widely as such an enormous mandate to leave the UK that to disrespect the people's choice is to disregard the principles of democracy. It is indicative of the wider preference. We think that voting is the key political institution in the function of modern democratic societies. Not to uphold this outcome would be to uproot the very definition of democracy. Things like expressing political opinions, we think that voting is the key political institution for the function of modern democratic societies. Things like expressing political opinions through the affinity groups is a tool of privileged classes who have the money, the resources, and the time to develop political ambitions. Now, why exactly is this important? Well, voting for many people is the key, exclusive, and sole means through which they have the ability to express their political views. For the people who don't have the money, for the vast majorities who don't have the resources and don't have the time to partake in these affinity groups that more privileged upper-class people would, this takes away a huge part of their voice in society. Voting is also a fundamental pillar of including the people in political design. This discounts people in society who do not have the same opportunities and do not have the same resources as those who partake in affinity groups. If people make a stupid decision in their vote, that is their prerogative. This is outlined again by the writ of democracy. Democracy, then, is respecting difference and not policing difference or regulating difference. This is not democratic. Yes?
Okay. Democratic freedoms are often curtailed in situations of emergency, and there's incredible precedent for this in all international arenas. Why is the consideration of future generations not one of them that is legitimate as we've shown in our case?
Thank you for asking that. If you let me continue with my speech, that will be touched on. And if it's not touched on by me, my partner Sophie will gladly respond. popularity in their views, saying, hey look, our government is incompetent. The EU is bullying us. We need to break away. Then this will effectively cede control of the government to these far-right groups who would pursue policies that are racist and fundamentally non-democratic. Yes.
What is the actual percentage of UK population that voted to leave?
A vast majority. It's a vast majority of people. Now take, for example, Angela Merkel and other heads of state and important EU figures that have come out and refused to negotiate any trade or diplomatic deals or policies with the UK until now. Take, for example, Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, who will not engage in these activities with the UK until they trigger Article 50. This is important because the EU is on the offensive. They're concerned about spillover. They're concerned about these domino effects of populism throughout Europe, such as right-wing factions in France, right-wing factions in Germany. And they are terrified that a quote-unquote weak EU perception will inevitably catalyze the decline of all EU institutions. So what? What does this mean? Well, this means that if the UK backs off the referendum agenda, then the EU will capitalize on this political opportunity to demonstrate strength. This will mean that the UK will get bad deals if it goes back to the table with the EU, because the EU now has this leverage. Yes?
Do you realize that the EU has absolutely no incentive to be mean, to quote you, to the UK if it leaves, because that is the principle on which the European Union is founded?
Even though we might understand that, it still doesn't change the fact that it gives these far-right groups ammunition to garner popularity and possibly cede control of the government, or acquiesce control of the government, rather. Which brings me to my third point. We think that ignoring referendum leads to an immense political and social state of unrest, which will effectively destabilize the UK. So look, we must remember that the vote was not close. Leave won by a large margin. If we disregard the political view that has already been voiced and cataloged so incredibly publicly, and in such a legitimate political institution, we believe that we empower populist, xenophobic, right-wing politics and parties within Britain. We think that Europe is rife with this unrest. Please, if you will, look at France, look at Germany, look at Norway. Now, the UK itself has somehow kept a cap on groups like UKIP from taking over until now. But once referendum is ignored, Parliament will be filled with right-wing demagogues who impose racist and isolationist policies. For these reasons, I am so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Presumably, side opposition cares a lot about democracy, and we recognize that on our side of the House. But what we contend to is that we don't actually think this vote was upheld under our ideal situations in which we conduct democratic votes, and that's what my speech today is going to be about. I'm going to introduce some more constructive on our side of the House as to why, in the way that the vote was cast, it was undemocratic, it was cast in a fury of passion against xenophobic voters, and then go on to some refutation of what we heard come out of opposition. So let's start with some new constructive on our side. The biggest question that we have about this vote is why did so many people vote to leave if it was so obvious from so many experts even beforehand that this was absolutely detrimental to Britain in any way concerning their economies or their social policies or their relationships with other countries. The reason is because there were certain parties in the UK that essentially had the tagline of "Let's take back control," because they spread this rhetoric that look, because of the refugee crisis and because of recent attacks on places like Brussels and in Paris and France, that we should all be scared that people are coming into the country. We should all be scared that we have an open border policy. Recognize, though, however, this literal tagline is made to attract people's emotions towards the situation. Recognize that this situation is something that is maybe temporary for the next little bit, right? Brexit is something that is permanent. The refugee crisis, or these situations, yes, they're an eminent issue currently, but by the time it takes for Brexit to actually happen, it will be 2 to 3 years, and maybe even in 5 or 10 years, this won't be a threat or something that is in these people's minds anymore, right? So we don't think that a vote cast based off people's emotions actually had that information. Yes.
People don't just forget that like Britain chose to leave and voted to leave. You're still going to have that kind of economic like uncertainty on either side of the house.
Okay, so we think that that's greatly amplified on your side, right? Because recognize that this is only the tip of the iceberg, right? And if we don't leave the EU right now, the state will be as bad as it gets. If we actually do choose to leave the EU, then every single bad effect that has happened so far will be amplified tenfold. We think that maybe people won't forget for the next little bit, but if we actually leave, it's going to make us exponentially worse because we actually left. Right? Now let's do some refutation on the other side. And I think the greatest contention that they have in opposition is, look, this isn't democratic. I'm going to show you in a couple of ways why this vote itself did not happen under their so-called pretty pillars of democracy, right? A couple responses. First of all, recognize that in an actual democracy, when you cast a vote, you vote again in 4 to 5 years in case you've changed your mind, right? So kind of when I decide who the prime minister of my country is, I have 4 to 5 years to stick with that, and in case the situation of the country changes, or in case my mind changes, I have the option to vote again. That doesn't happen in this situation. This is a permanent vote, and my partner essentially tells you that this policy affects the young generation the most, overwhelmingly who voted to stay in the EU, right? So we think that should be taken in consideration. Secondly, we would tell you, my partner pointed this out in a POI, in a state of emergency, usually the government is able to overrule the will of the people. We think that Britain is about to enter a very great state of emergency in terms of what we've already seen in terms of their economic downfall. Thirdly, we would say that it's actually not an overwhelming majority of the country that voted, right? First of all, recognize that not every single person in the country voted, but secondly, 52% of the individuals who voted to leave. So if you actually do the math, that's probably less than half of the country when you consider all the citizens, right? We don't even think that more than half the country actually wants to leave. This number isn't an accurate depiction of what people want, right? Fourthly, we would tell you that not everyone was even informed during the vote, and the reason that I have to prove this is because after the day that Brexit happened, the biggest Google search was, what is Brexit, right? And if that is not an indication of people's misinformedness, then I don't know what is, right? Because it's this fury of passion, this rhetoric that was pushed by those who were part of the Leave Party that basically clouded people's their minds in order to make rational decisions. Fifthly, we think that if we're so concerned about everyone being able to have their voice heard, or small groups being able to have their voice heard, we think there are so many barriers in terms of actually getting those smaller groups being able to vote, right? What about the fact that the vote wasn't cast on a national holiday? What about all the barriers that individuals, minorities have, lower income families have in terms of getting access to polling stations, right? Because they can't take time off work if they want to go to these polling stations. We think here are numerous examples of different barriers that exist that delegitimize this so-called democratic vote that happened on their side of the house, right? So we really think that we're not overruling the pillars of democracy that Britain stands on. In fact, the vote itself, if we actually wanted to reconduct another referendum where everyone was informed and everyone had a chance, I'm pretty sure the way that the numbers would fall is that more people would vote to stay this time, right? Because now they are informed after the thing that happened. Even those who voted, and they did interviews, people who voted to leave said that, oh wait, now that I realize this is real, I wish I'd voted to stay, right? And that's something that actually happens currently. Then they tell you quickly these ideas that the EU will now be mean to us. My partner addressed this in a POI. No, you are literally economically tied together. If you are mean to Britain, your economy also suffers. They have no interest whatsoever to be completely mean to the EU. And then they make some point about right-wing xenophobic parties. Recognize that those are the same parties that push this emotional rhetoric that our country is now going to be filled with people who attack us, who wanted to leave. We don't think that's valid on their side of the house. They made no rational decision considering all the factors. What we want you to take away from opening government is that we think that in order for a country to make an informed, proper decision about the well-being of their citizens, that vote firstly needs to be upheld completely in terms of what the overwhelming majority of the country wants, but secondly needs to be something that the experts and through numerical, empirical trends, which is actually beneficial. For those reasons, we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now welcome
unstable situation, and the EU is absolutely going to peacock and take advantage of that to demonstrate its strength. So before I get into a more comparative analysis of what happened between Kaya's speech and their speeches, I think we had really a lot of unresponsiveness coming from that second speaker. I have 3 points of rebuttal outstanding. On the first, I actually think it's super problematic. The thing they keep talking about is passion and emotion as a reason we shouldn't care about somebody's vote. That was literally the political argument used to deny women and minorities the vote for years and years. You cannot take that on face, because that, we think, is a complete denial of the principles of democracy. Because we think that that's absolutely not a reason to vote. Like we said before, the whole idea of democracy is based on the premise it's one person, one vote of equal value. It's not up to us to determine whether or not that vote, where that vote comes from. All it is to say that you have the ability to express it, we respect it. Second point of rebuttal in terms of long-term and short-term, So on the first, in terms of like immediate impact, so bad, demonstrates that everything's going to shit. Like, UK economy has actually been recovering slowly, but been recovering since it happened. Like, the reason all of the bad stuff happened immediately was because Brexit was a shock. That's what happens in economic markets when something unexpected or with unpredictable consequences happen. It means it goes into flux. We don't think it's necessarily indicative of a long-term trajectory. We actually think the EU is benefiting, which we think is bad for them, because we think what that means is that when they talk about state of emergency as their principle, they needed to prove to us the burden that, like, they need to prove to us that this literally was a state of emergency where it was acceptable to do that. Those kinds of things are, like, reserved for wars and natural disasters. We do not think that a recovering economy from a shock is equitable in any sense at all. When they say to us, I'll save that for later, when they talk about how, like, youth are affected the most, so we need to care about them the most, their vote matters the most. 2 responses. First of all, this is untrue. Like, a lot of the retirees in the UK are actually going to have their pensions docked because of if they leave the EU. So we think that's actually not true that they're the ones who are necessarily losing out the most. We don't think that you can kind of like qualify that. And that's the exact reason why the democratic principle of one person, one vote of equal value exists, is because there is literally no fair standard to like quantify or qualify the disparate impact of a policy on an individual. That's why we have the kind of equality across the board. We don't think we can just say that, oh, well, they might have an impact. That just cannot be a reason. Third response to them, when they whine about like the bad public debate that preceded Brexit, right? 3 responses. First of all, that exact atmosphere, the exact reason that happened in the world is going to be amplified when the EU hunkers down on you and is like, no, we're actually peacocking, we're going to demonstrate strength, we're going to force you into these deals that we want that is better for us. We think that that's the exact atmosphere that's going to lead to the types of policies that we're talking about. Secondly, look at all of the hate crimes that happened after the EU, all the political unrest that we're saying, this isn't just a normal backlash might happen argument. It literally happened. We think it's going to get so much worse under their side of the house. And thirdly, when they talk about like the what is Brexit thing, also I just think that like $10, that was someone who didn't even vote and wanted to know what everyone was talking about anyway. So like that's not, like a Google search is not proof of your argument, but go ahead.
Okay, the EU pushing really hard deals on UK, for example, accentuates right-wing rhetoric that the EU is harmful for individual countries. Why would it ever want to do
So
that?
this is the comparative on the right-wing stuff, right? Because obviously both sides are going to say right-wing is going to get worse. But we've demonstrated clearly, so actually I'll turn it around like this. Their own argument that the EU is going to be mean to them is literally the logic that the EU is trying to strengthen itself and demonstrate its own strength in the face of opposition, in the face of trying to maintain its survival. Their own argument buys into our argument in giving us the logic about why the EU is going to penalize the UK to showcase strength. When they talk to you about right-wing nationalism as something that's going to happen, like, look, right-wing nationalism is going to happen on either side of the house. We just think that it's far likelier that when you literally go back against the mandate that the right-wing parties say hold up as literally the key to their success is demonstrating their one and pure and only success in that country, we think it buys into literally all of their rhetoric about the ivory tower elites, about the Eton College graduates running our country. We think that you actually buy into all of the things that the right-wing party uses to mobilize and nationalize support against the EU and against immigrants that we think is so particularly harmful. Let's do some more comparisons, right? Because look, the democratic legitimacy stuff we got out of Kaya. Because OG foundation of modern democracies, and that's also important. And so when they talk about, by the way, this was an annoying thing. When she said like 4 years as like, well, that's how you know it's like more democratic. That's only true of like presidential and heads of state elections. That's not true of referenda. Like we don't redo referenda votes every 4 years. After a referendum votes happen, we allow it to happen. And maybe like 10 or 15 years later, we look into it, but we wouldn't be doing that for a long time. We just think it is far too early to tell the effects of Brexit before you can make the sweeping claim that we need to undo it, right? So then we get in terms of the worst, I actually already explained that, in terms of destabilizing the UK, we also got no response at all to this point. When she talks to you about the political unrest, I talk to you about the hate crimes and the right-wing parties that are on the rise. We tell you that they're currently a small part of parliament, but insofar as you literally feed into every single thing they use to describe why it is that all like the current powers in place are bad, and like the bad demagogues in Europe sitting in their little chairs and not listening to us, we think that the point at which you literally disregard the one thing that they hold most dear to their whole like campaign. Like Nigel Farage literally was like, after Brexit, I'm good because I did the one thing I needed to do in my political career. We think that you actually just mobilize all of these people further. It's going to be so much worse. Insofar as Europe is already like on the brink of developing into this like nationalist populist movement with the rise of the refugee crisis, we think for all those reasons you have to respect the democratic legitimacy, no matter how stupid they may have been. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you very much.
Hate to break it to opposition, but sometimes, just sometimes, democracy isn't the most important thing in the world. My extension today is going to be about the sociology of Brexit and why exactly the people who voted for it aren't going to get what they want. That's fine and good, but I'm also going to tell you that everything about leaving the EU makes these disenfranchised voters even less likely to get the kinds of results they wanted in the first place, resulting in the further alienation and empowerment of right-wing groups they talked about. 2 points of contention for today's debate. First of all, will the EU welcome the UK back? And second of all, money, but only very briefly. First of all, will the EU welcome the UK back? Yes, because they don't want to set a precedent that countries can leave. The leaders of states represented in the EU are trying to block the very right-wing parties that opening opposition talks about. Nobody really wants Marine Le Pen to actually be able to do anything. These also happen to be the kinds of parties that are pushing for EU referendums in Italy and France right now. Therefore, the leaders of states in the EU have an absolute incentive to take the UK back in order to block these right-wing parties from being able to use UK as a precedent. No. Second of all, let's talk about money. Look, 40% of financial services FDI comes from the EU. And guess what? Financial services FDI are really, really mobile, okay? Deutsche Bank and Goldman Sachs have already pulled back operations in the UK. Nissan and other car companies all have already stressed the importance of the single market to them and have also pulled back operations. Maybe there's going to be a slight recovery. It's never going to hit the kind of levels that we need. Not only that, I will also say the younger EU migrants to the UK pay taxes, and there are many more of them than there are older British like people that have like healthcare costs. Right. Let's talk about alternatives, okay? The US and the UK is just too weak right now to compete with US and China. Maybe they will get some kind of deal. The problem with such deals is that they always reflect political realities on the ground. This means you are unlikely to get a similar favorable kind of deal as you would within the EU. I don't think that needs more explaining. Right. Sociology of Brexit and why this is really important. Recognize, honorable panel, that this referendum was called by mainstream politicians trying to fend off pressure from populists, okay? Cameron only called for this referendum because he was trying desperately to hang on to the last vestiges of his power. He was pushed by Eurosceptic backbenchers to adopt a tougher line with Brussels. Why is this important? It's important because the referendum diverts attention away from shitty failed policies everywhere else. Now when these areas complain that they do not have the economic resources and policies necessary to continue their own standard of living, people can now point to Brexit and say, well, you got what you wanted, didn't you? This is especially important because places like London voted overwhelmingly to remain. I'm going to go into this in a lot more depth, but before that, I will take one from back.
Presumably, though, there are still reasons why I, as a company, might be interested in investing in the UK. You don't get rid of some of like the natural benefits of being in the UK.
I'm not sure what the natural benefits of being on a small rock in the middle of the ocean are. I mean, also, as you point out, that a lot of the natural benefits from being in the UK come from the fact that if you are trying to export to the EU, you don't have to pay taxes.
much. We now welcome the member of opposition.
I am infinitely tired of debates where we get up and we look at the decisions that people who are low income make and simply call them irrational. We simply call them emotional because they weren't emotional. This is the most important thing to realize, that for the vast majority of the UK, the EU didn't do very much. The EU only harmed them more. These are places like Lincolnshire, who takes in 13% of immigration to the EU, right? This is not London, right? This is not the inside of London. This is the outskirt regions. You have to engage with actual Euroscepticism because it existed before the migrant crisis. It existed because people realized that sometimes having people, a massive influx of people, is harmful in and of itself. We think that that is a problem. Before I go into my own speech, which is called Cultural Divides and Euroscepticism, and maybe why the EU is going to fail and why we should jump on this burning ship anyway, I have 3 points of rebuttal. First, about young people and who matters in this debate. One, if the reason that Remain lost was because young people didn't turn out to vote, that's their loss. You had the ability to go out and vote. Apparently, you are smart and educated enough to go out and vote. If you sat your ass at home and chose not to vote, and now you have to deal with all the problems because you live in London and all the people are going to leave, that's your problem. You should have gone out and voted. Should have spent that time. There aren't all these voter suppression things happening in the UK, right? This is not that's a US problem. Don't use US analysis to then analyze a UK debate. But more importantly, old people matter too. The way in which they see the world matter too. Wisdom. I don't know. Then about the financial crisis. One, remember, it's just kind of difficult for most companies to just dip out of London. And the point in which Barclays is one of the largest banks in the world. It's very hard for companies and groups and financial groups to just completely leave. We think that it might be easy for just Goldman Sachs. Overwhelmingly, we don't think you see the mass exodus. This is likely why the destabilizing only happened for 2 days and then it went back to how it was, right? This is likely why that happened. But 2, we think that they're now, we think the shock is likely to be short-lived, just as I said. But when Intin gets up and she says that the things don't change for the people in Wales, they don't change for the people in Lincolnshire, things like that. We think that leaving the EU is a chance for a new tomorrow for the UK. What do I mean? Before, there was no incentive at all to make things better in Wales and in Lincolnshire and in all of these places. There was no incentive because you knew that you would always get workers from Lithuania to take those places. We think that now you have to find a way to do creating works progress administration. We've seen this happen before, people. We've seen people get jobs and create systems. We think that this happens again. We can do this again. Before, there was no incentive. Imminent doom is a really good incentive to do this. The UK isn't going to just allow itself to fall into the sea, right? It was once one of the most powerful nations on earth. Is it likely to just relinquish this and go, you know what, I really just fuck it. Then about nationalism, and I will take you, actually I was closing this, Ryan, I'm opening, sorry. I'll take opening in a second. Nationalism and Brexit. One, what I said about, quote, emotional poor people still stands, right? The analysis, your analysis doesn't take into account the fact that a lot of the reasons that people chose leave wasn't because they were racist, but because they were experiencing a massive amount of economic deprivation in the places in which they live. And they saw immigrants, people who came from other places like Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Latvia, getting the jobs that they thought they deserved, right? Because of low education levels, deprivation, things like that. Because the UK never invested in those people because they didn't have to. We think that now they have to make that better. When you talk about, what is Brexit, Sophie already said this quite eloquently, but that is probably the people who didn't vote and are now just what's going on? But even if it was, who really cares? If you search what is Brexit. But more importantly, I don't think you provide us a link for how you fix right-wing nationalism on your side either. Because
that has only two choices, which are coerced on the basis of you will lose your job versus you will lose your life, how is that a fair referendum to hold in the first place?
Well, who gave them that choice? Like, the choice was stay in the UK or stay in the EU or leave. What part of that is losing your job or losing your life? Like, we think that the people who chose to lose their jobs short term chose that because they know that the options for Britain in the future are far better than the ones that currently exist. Euroscepticism and cultural divides. Anker gets up here and he says, we should care about the people who will be disproportionately experience this decision the most. Okay, well let's talk about those people, because they're not just youth writ large, right? They're not just any old youth, because there are lots of youths living in London who probably won't be impacted all that heavily by this, right? They still have their nice degrees, they went to Eton, it's great. We think that there are people who are actually impacted. Who are these people? They're people who live in Lincolnshire, who voted 77% of their, like, the voter turnout in that area was 77%, which means even youth in that area voted in support of it. And in that area, 76% said that they wanted to leave the EU. Why? Because they have seen the real-life impacts of immigration. It's not just the migrant crisis, but EU migration overall. Euroscepticism is a completely valid set of views. Why? Because the EU is unstable inherently. It is literally dependent on certain countries taking a hit over and over and over and over again. See countries like the UK, France, and Germany. The problem with this is those problems don't filter down to people equally, right? They filter down outside of London, right? So the impacts of, like, the EU impact people on the outskirts of the UK far more than they do internally. We think at the point at which this is true, the decision that they made was perfectly legitimate and perfectly understandable. We think that the point at which the damage has already been done, the point at which we already see places like the Netherlands and France calling to leave as well, the EU is a sinking ship, and the UK might as well just jump off it now because it's all going down anyway. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. We now welcome the government whip.
In the status quo, the reason we don't allow you to sell yourself into slavery, even if that wasn't a decision you made emotionally but rather rationally, even if that was a decision you made considering all implications, is because it precludes your ability to access any meaningful change in the future. On closing government, what we brought to you is that the creation, the existence of Brexit and Brexit, what Brexit actually means is that the removal of alternatives for people in the future and actually worsens their lives in the short term and the long term. So firstly, I'm going to look at the sociology of Brexit. I'm going to look at why this directly deals all of closing, what we call closing opposition. Right? So firstly, what we tell you on our side of the house, we showed you that the reason for why we think that the reason why we think that so all of opening materials are a bit about why this is an appeal to emotion and how people didn't vote rationally, right? But the reason we told you it was uncalled for is because of the fact that this is following decades and decades of systematic exclusion of these people, right? Why does it mean that why does it not necessarily mean that Brexit is beneficial? We showed you that what happens on their side of the house is that you actually mark the real reasons for why these sentiments existed in the first place. Why is that the case? It means that you use this referendum therefore as an excuse to deny the very changes that you were pushing for in the first place. We saw this pretty self-evidently when Nigel Farage just resigned, and we don't think NHS change is going to become better on their side of the house, right? But furthermore, we showed you specifically that the areas which voted to leave are going to suffer the most on their side of the house, right? Why is this the case? Firstly, because of the fact that it becomes very easy, therefore, for governments the government that is currently in power within the EU to say that these people are the ones to blame for the fallout that come inevitably from Brexit itself. This is particularly important because, secondly, as we pointed out to you in this debate, the fact that these are the people often who are most reliant on the EU, for example, like farmers who are reliant on subsidies from the EU, who are going to be most affected by this policy, but also will get the least amount of recompense for this because they are seen as to blame for the same. We've shown you by the creation of the shadow welfare state, for example, it's an issue that's totally ignored because these people people are seen as a problem, and the reason that these people are seen as the ones who will be fixing those problems because we already gave you what you wanted, which is to leave the EU. Why does this mean that all of ops case becomes worse? Right? Even if we take their best case, even if we think that the EU is going to benefit economically from this policy, it means that it still won't go to the people who have wanted this economic benefits anyway. Why is that important in this debate? Why is it important that the people in Sunderland, for example, don't get the benefits that they push on these people? It means that, for example, the right-wing rhetoric that they want to talk about becomes far worse on their side of the house anyway, right? Because if these people don't continue to get those benefits and are instead blamed for the actions that happened due to Brexit, that means these people will continue to accentuate right-wing rhetoric. Right-wing rhetoric, in fact, becomes legitimized on their side of the house. On our side of the house, in fact, when we stay within the EU and we get those benefits anyway, we think that we actually minimize the effect of right-wing rhetoric on our side of the house. Secondly, let's look at their idea that we should be holding people accountable to their works, and even if it's a stupid decision, it's a decision that people make anyway. Firstly, you got from the entire government bench that you necessarily didn't get information about the kind of what you got on our side of the house. Right? It's not sufficient to just merely thrust a vote on people and assume that they make the right choice. It's about providing them information and the time to do that. But specifically, what did we give you on closing? We've talked to you about why democracy isn't an inherent good in and of itself. Right? We prioritize democracy in the status quo because we show you that in most cases, it's the most effective way to aggregate self-interest in a manner in which we can achieve best results. Why is that not the case here? All of the reasons that I showed you as to why these people have been systematically disenfranchised to vote in a manner that they will want to leave, but also the fact that these people will not get those benefits on your side of the house anyway. Therefore, even principally, we think that our side of the house better achieves these benefits because we think that governments are legitimate to prioritize the benefits and the benefits to the people that will accrue and removing the harms that will accrue as a result of this policy, as opposed to merely prioritizing democracy because it's good for some political reason. Right? So I'm going to look next at benefits of what are the problems with leaving the EU and why we think it's particularly beneficial, particularly relevant to this debate, but I'll take opening.
If it were true that the EU is going to so happily take on the UK as they explain, why are Merkel and other EU officials currently refusing to even sit down and negotiate with them until Theresa May triggers Article 50? Is that not a demonstration of strength?
Not really, because firstly, I'd like to point out to you that the biggest thing we think is harming the EU, harming UK right now in terms of getting deals with the EU is its indecisiveness. Right? At the point which the EU decisively says that it wants to remain within the EU, regardless of the issue of the referendum, we think that all of those problems are solved on the outside of the house. But I'm going to be specifically looking at EU incentives later. Firstly, the fallout that accrues as a result of this policy. Economically, we've shown you on our side of the house why it's important to note that this isn't just the temporary fallout of just the pound dropping 10% or 12% on their side of the house, right? The problems are going to become infinitely worse when you permanently leave Britain, permanently leave the EU, and that's what we've shown you on our side of the house, right? It seems it's already evident, in fact, that Deutschland is already leaving UK and setting up base in other countries, right? It's insufficient for them to claim that historically the UK has been extremely good and therefore the UK will continue to be good for these countries. At the point which people recognize that most of the benefits that they accrue from UK happen as a result of it being a part of the EU and none of those benefits apply on their side of the house, then these companies will still refuse to go to the UK anyway, right? But even if in their best case these companies for some reason continue to remain in the UK, we've shown you that there is still on net a harm on their side of the house in that you still not regain the ability that you get, which is not the case on our side of the house because these companies are much more likely to go back to the UK if you have the promise of the fact that they're going to remain in the EU, which we think is beneficial, and which is beneficial from the status quo, which is indecisiveness, and we think that's important in this debate. Lastly, secondly, right, the idea that all of this, again to emphasize that all of this fallout is blamed on the people who voted to leave. Right? This is important because it means that all of the economic recompense that you get, even on their side of the house, is not going to be directed to these people anyway. Right? This is important because these people are most affected by this. Lastly, I'm going to look a bit at EU incentives. Right? We think it's pretty ridiculous to look at demonstrating strength as the EU's incentives as a whole. Right? As we already pointed out to you through a POI, we've shown you why, in fact, the EU has extreme incentives to not feed into the right-wing rhetoric that the EU is particularly harmful for countries, right? Which is why the EU isn't going to push as hard a deal on you because if it doesn't want those rhetoric to happen anyway. But secondly, we also showed you on closing that we don't want the EU to set precedent for countries wanting to leave the EU in the first place, right? Which is why we think it's extremely beneficial for the EU to take back countries and to make sure that countries don't want to leave the EU at the rate at which they want to do so right now. On closing up government, we've shown you why we think that the people who are affected most by this policy who chose to leave will be further affected on their side of the house. We've shown you why democracy isn't an inherent good and we need to weigh the harms of this policy, and we've shown you why Britain is infinitely worse on their side of the house. Incredibly proud of the boss.
Thank you very much. We now welcome the opposition group.
I think a lot of government arguments would work if all of a sudden people seemed to forget that this vote happened, seemed to forget that the EU isn't necessarily this perfect system, right? I think at the point at which, yes, maybe I go back into the EU, but yes, maybe that system is permanently changed, and yes, maybe perception of the UK is permanently changed, they still need to fight a lot of the harms that come with it, right? We prefer a world in which, if the harms exist on both sides of the house, we prefer a world in which the UK has some sort of control over mitigating those harms, over a world in which they get back into the EU and now have to compete in terms of getting some sort of power back into the EU. We think that's the main point and main contention that we are coming from our side. I have 2 points of clusterization. The first one is, why is this legitimate? Which I think covers a lot of what both teams said. The second one being, will the economy be good back? So first, in terms of legitimacy, what did we hear from opening, right? So opening says, you have buyer's remorse, more or less, right? You're gonna regret this vote. That's not how votes work, right? If I vote for Donald Trump and Emperor Donald Trump comes into power, I'm not gonna take that vote back. That's just not how voting works. You don't get to simply change your mind based on the outcome. We think that, first of all, delegitimizes the vote. But then they also say this ridiculous point about, oh, maybe people didn't have access to vote. Well, I think Mayor perfectly deals with this, and she says that's probably not true in the UK. But 2, if that's the reason, then that's a reason to never vote ever. We think that's absolutely absurd. But then they also make this ridiculous claim that only the young people matter and old people's votes don't count for as much, right? I don't stop being a citizen insofar as I'm going to die in 5 years. We still think that input is valuable, right? That the way with the country that they have to live in the next 5 years is completely valuable and more important. I think we hear the more sophisticated argument of this coming from Closing Path when they're talking about the people who voted for this are now going to be the ones most impacted, right? That they're now, the buyer's remorse that they now have to buy into are ones in which they don't actually realize the kinds of harms that are going to occur to them. I think this actually deals with a lot of material like Kamara gives in her speech, right? Because I think Kamara gives you really good legitimacy claims. She tells you that necessarily the biggest costs are, the biggest cost to remaining in the EU actually were to those people, right? What does she tell you? She tells you that countries have different benefits, right? Countries have different, strength economies. We tell you that countries and people living in Lithuania and countries living in more Eastern European EU countries, necessarily those workers face worse economic situations and can afford to go to the UK and undercut prices for jobs, undercut prices in terms of what I'm getting paid. What this actually results in is a lot of the people who are most upset about this vote being upset that they don't really have any sort of control over their wages, right? We tell you that insofar as the EU allows for things like open borders, there's no real control for wages within the UK, and that's why these people are the most harmed. We tell you that the UK doesn't necessarily need to care about this, right? Insofar as they can have the same economic benefit and pay workers less, that is an overwhelming a benefit to them. We tell you that insofar as they do vote to leave, they now have to care about these workers. They now have to actually set wages at a fair price. We think that's just a benefit to the people who voted to leave and why that's the case. But more importantly, when CG says these are the people to blame, they tell you that they're the most reliant on social handouts. We tell you that the reason that they're most reliant to social handouts are for exactly the analysis that Kamara gives you, the fact that they aren't able to compete for the same wages as other countries, right? I think we necessarily need to realize that this debate takes place not in terms of those who are the most rich who can take this cost, right? Because we don't think the UK is going to go away. We don't think they're going to improve that. But it's going to take place on those who are the most on the outskirts. I think that's really sort of the harms that they have to buy into. Would you say opening? Closing.
Oh, cool. Well, so you say that there are no more foreign workers, and that's all great, but it also means there are now shrinking job industries and even less incentive to give these remaining jobs to these individuals in Sunderland, as well as the fact there is increasing social stigma around them. So how exactly does your slide change anything for the better?
Look, here's the problem, right? Kamara, this goes into my next point. Will the economy be good back? You have to provide some sort of link about why necessarily we think industries are going to just disappear, or that these jobs are just necessarily going to disappear, right? We don't think this necessarily is something that happens overnight. I think Kamara gives you a lot of reasons for this, right? So the second question, will the economy be good bad, right? So what is the reason that Khmer tells you that necessarily we don't buy into a lot of the harms that are going to happen, right? We say that investments still happen, right? Insofar as I might have an investment in a bank that is based in the UK, or insofar as I'm a US bank and I own loans from from a UK bank. Those don't just appear overnight, right? We think that necessarily that kind of debt still people care about. But more importantly, the UK itself still has all the same debts that it used to have, right? Presumably other countries are going to want to engage in these kinds of trade negotiations that they're talking about insofar as they're going to want to get their money back, right? We still think that there's lots of incentives and lots of reasons why places are still going to want to care about the UK. But I think also that just the fact that we've already seen it return is evidence that this isn't necessarily the biggest economic harm that we're actually going to face, right? I think insofar as that's true, we need to realize that the biggest problem that they actually face now is the EU, right? This doesn't only destabilize the UK, this also makes the European Union experiment look really bad. Insofar as countries are willing to leave it, insofar that the UK was willing to leave it, this also tarnishes their reputation. Why is this the case? Look at the fact that insofar as other countries are now talking about it, it's really, really important, right? Insofar as they view it possible for the UK to leave, means that these other countries it justifies that kind of action. More importantly, we think insofar as the economic cost that the UK has taken hasn't been that big, means that it now legitimizes more for France, right? The fact that they've largely bounced back from the initial shock means that it looks more appealing to France. But more importantly, it just gives France guidelines for why they would be able to do this in the future, right? We think that necessarily they can do the kinds of things like planning ahead, preparing for it, right? We think this doesn't go away just because they go back, right? We think that people probably remember, and we think that's really important for this debate on why. Because we think that the economic harms aren't that bad, and that France is going to be able to do things like plan for the future, right? So insofar as all their economic harms exist on either side of the house, we think that the fact that this further destabilizes the EU makes it more dangerous to get involved in the EU, right? We tell you that it necessarily is a sinking ship insofar as a lot of countries have lost faith in it, right? The kinds of investment, if we believe everything that they're saying, that investment has shrunk from the UK, then it's likely true that investment has also shrunk from the EU in general, right? That in terms of stability, any sort of leaving or any sort of lack of faith that the UK, people that in the UK show necessarily makes it less appealing to also invest in the EU, right? So we think that we're at odds, right? So either we go back into the EU and people are still going to remember this happens, or we try to negotiate new trade deals and we try to rebuild investor confidence, right? We think that we're more likely to do that on our side of the house. We think that we give the UK people more agency than on our side of the house. For those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.